To truly grasp whether an avoidant misses you, you first need to understand the way their mind operates. This isn't about guessing or making assumptions. It's about stepping into their world and seeing things from their perspective. When you understand how an avoidant thinks, you stop taking their actions personally and start seeing the patterns that reveal their true feelings. An avoidant attachment style develops as a response to early experiences, often rooted in childhood. Many avoidants grew up in environments where emotional needs were not met in a consistent or comforting way. They may have had caregivers who were emotionally distant, overwhelmed, or dismissive. As a result, they learned that depending on others for emotional support was risky. They internalized the belief that vulnerability leads to disappointment, rejection, or even abandonment. Because of this, avoidants build emotional walls, not because they don't care, but because caring deeply feels unsafe. Their independence becomes their armor, their distance becomes their defense mechanism, and their silence becomes their way of protecting themselves. Unlike someone with a secure attachment who openly expresses feelings and desires connection, an avoidant feels conflicted. They may want intimacy but fear losing their sense of self within it. Now, this is where things get interesting. Just because an avoidant distances themselves doesn't mean they don't miss you. In fact, many avoidants miss people intensely, but their way of handling that emotion is vastly different from someone with a secure or anxious attachment. Instead of reaching out, instead of expressing longing, they withdraw further, they suppress, they distract themselves. They convince themselves that needing someone is a weakness, even when deep down they feel the void your absence has created. An avoidant's first instinct when missing someone isn't to say, "I miss you." Instead, it's to regain control. They might focus more on work, pick up a new hobby, spend time with friends, or even engage in surface-level connections with others. These aren't necessarily signs that they've moved on. These are signs that they're avoiding the intensity of their emotions. They rationalize that distancing themselves will make the feelings fade, and for a while, it might work. However, emotions don't just disappear. The more an avoidant suppresses their longing, the more it builds up beneath the surface. This is why, over time, you may notice them re-entering your orbit in subtle ways, checking your social media, sending a casual text, or showing up in places you frequent. These aren't random actions. They are the result of their internal conflict between needing space and craving connection. Another key aspect of the avoidant mindset is their tendency to downplay emotions. Not just their own, but yours as well. If you've ever expressed deep feelings to an avoidant, you may have noticed them shutting down or becoming distant afterward. This isn't because they don't care, it's because vulnerability triggers discomfort. It reminds them of past experiences where emotional closeness led to hurt or rejection. So instead of leaning into connection, they instinctively pull away to regain a sense of emotional safety. But here's what's crucial to understand. Just because they pull away doesn't mean they've erased their feelings. Avoidants may go long periods without contact, but that doesn't mean they aren't thinking about you. In fact, because they tend to process emotions internally rather than outwardly, they may be thinking about you far more than you realize. They just won't broadcast it the way someone with a more expressive attachment style would. When an avoidant misses you, their internal dialogue often sounds like this. I wonder what they're doing, but if I reach out, will they expect too much? I miss them, but maybe it's better this way. I don't want to deal with emotions. I care about them, but I also need to protect myself. This push-pull dynamic is at the core of an avoidance struggle with intimacy. They want connection, but they fear it. They crave love, but they worry about losing themselves in it. They miss you, but reaching out feels like stepping into dangerous territory. Another important factor to recognize is how an avoidant deals with time and space. Unlike someone with an anxious attachment who feels urgency in resolving distance, an avoidant operates on a different timeline. They often need significant time away before they can even acknowledge what they're feeling. If you're expecting an immediate response, you'll likely be disappointed. Their process is slower, more internalized, and driven by their deep-seated need to maintain control over their emotions. This is why even when they miss you, they might not act on it right away. It can take weeks, even months, for them to realize the full impact of your absence. When they do, it doesn't usually come with a grand romantic gesture or an emotional confession. Instead, it manifests in small but telling ways. Subtle reappearances, casual check-ins, or indirect signs that they're still paying attention. Understanding the avoidant mindset is about recognizing that their distance isn't always a reflection of how much they care. More often, it's a reflection of their own struggles with intimacy. They may not express longing in the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. They may not chase, but that doesn't mean they don't feel your absence. The key is learning to see the signs that lie beneath their silence. When it comes to relationships, we're often conditioned to look for verbal affirmation, words that explicitly express love, longing, or regret. We want to hear, "I miss you," "I think about you all the time," or "I made a mistake." But when dealing with an avoidant, words are rarely the medium through which they communicate emotions. Instead, their true feelings are revealed through their actions, subtle, indirect, and often contradictory to what they say. Avoidants are experts at suppressing emotions. From a young age, they learned that expressing vulnerability wasn't safe or rewarding. Maybe they grew up in an environment where emotions were dismissed or met with indifference. Maybe they were taught that self-reliance was the only way to survive. Over time, they developed an instinct to downplay their own emotional needs, which carries over into their adult relationships. This is why even when they miss someone deeply, they struggle to verbalize it. But emotions, no matter how suppressed, always find a way to surface. For an avoidant, emotions don't come out in big declarations, they leak out in behavior. If you're wondering whether an avoidant misses you, stop focusing on their words or their lack of words and start paying attention to their actions. One of the most common ways an avoidant shows they miss you is by keeping a distant yet consistent presence in your life. They may not text you directly, but suddenly they're watching your stories on social media. They may not ask how you've been, but they like a post from weeks ago. They may not reach out, but you start hearing from mutual friends that they've been asking about you. These behaviors aren't random. Avoidants are intentional with their energy. When they check in on you in these passive ways, it's often because they're thinking about you more than they're willing to admit. Another major sign is their sudden and seemingly random contact. An avoidant isn't going to send a heartfelt message saying they miss you, but they might send something neutral, almost insignificant. "Hey, do you still have the login for that thing?" Or, "I just saw a movie that reminded me of you." On the surface, these messages appear casual, even meaningless. But they're not about the content of the message. They're about testing the waters, reestablishing a connection without making themselves vulnerable. Avoidants are highly calculated when it comes to reconnecting. Unlike anxious individuals who may impulsively reach out in a moment of longing, avoidants carefully consider their moves. When they send that message, it's not because they just happen to think of you. It's because they've been thinking about you for a while and finally built up the courage to do something about it in a way that doesn't expose them emotionally. A lesser-known sign that an avoidant misses you is their resistance to fully letting go. Even if they ended the relationship, even if they claimed they needed space, they don't truly cut you off. Maybe they still have your things and haven't made an effort to return them. Maybe they left some of their stuff with you and haven't asked for it back. Maybe they haven't removed you from their contacts, unfollowed you, or blocked you, even though they've had plenty of opportunities to do so. These small forms of attachment reveal that, on some level, they're still holding on. Another revealing behavior is when they resurface just as you begin to move on. Avoidants operate with a strong need for independence, but that doesn't mean they want to be forgotten. The moment they sense that you are truly detaching, whether it's through your silence, your happiness, or your attention shifting elsewhere, they feel an unspoken loss. It's as if their emotional defense mechanism suddenly malfunctions, and they feel an urge to reinsert themselves. This is why many people experience an ex or a former avoidant partner reappearing after they've finally stopped waiting for them. It's also important to note that avoidants can show they miss you by engaging in behaviors that seem contradictory. Instead of reaching out with kindness, they might act distant or indifferent when you do cross paths. Instead of acknowledging their feelings, they might make a casual remark about your life in a way that seems detached, but is actually their way of engaging without exposing themselves. For example, an avoidant might see you after months apart and say something like, "I see you're still doing that thing," instead of directly asking how you've been. These remarks are not about the words themselves. They're about the fact that they're paying attention. For some avoidants, missing you doesn't just show up in direct interactions, it also shows up in their patterns of avoidance. They might avoid certain places because they associate them with you. They might distance themselves from mutual friends to avoid conversations about you. They might even immerse themselves in new distractions, dating apps, social activities, work, or travel, because sitting with their feelings is too uncomfortable. The key here is that avoidance itself can be a sign of missing someone. The harder they try to suppress their emotions, the stronger those emotions often are. Another overlooked behavior is when an avoidant subtly tries to reopen the emotional connection through shared experiences. They might mention an inside joke you had together, reference an old memory, or casually bring up something only you would understand. These moments are their way of reminding you and themselves that the connection still exists, even if they aren't ready to fully re-engage. It's important to recognize that for an avoidant, missing someone doesn't look like what we typically expect. It doesn't come with a grand speech or a confession of longing. It comes in the form of indirect actions, quiet persistence, and resistance to completely letting go. When you shift your focus from their words to their behavior, you begin to see the truth that lies beneath their silence. When dealing with an avoidant, one of the biggest challenges is deciphering whether they truly miss you. Unlike someone with a secure or anxious attachment style, an avoidant does not express longing in obvious ways. Instead of direct words or dramatic actions, they leave behind subtle clues, small but powerful signs that they are still emotionally connected to you, even if they try to hide it. To understand these signs, it's important to recognize that avoidants are not emotionally detached. They are emotionally guarded. They may suppress their feelings, but that doesn't mean those feelings don't exist. The difference is that instead of reaching out openly, they tend to engage in indirect behaviors that signal their inner conflict. They want connection, but they fear vulnerability. They miss you, but they don't want to risk getting hurt. This leads to behaviors that may seem insignificant on the surface, but in reality reveal a great deal. One of the most common signs that an avoidant misses you is what I call passive engagement. This means they stay connected to your life without directly interacting with you. They might frequently check your social media, watch your stories, or even like a post from weeks ago. If you notice that they are still keeping tabs on you but not initiating direct contact, it's a strong indication that they are struggling with their emotions. Avoidants have a unique way of staying present in your life while maintaining emotional distance. You may notice that they suddenly resurface after a long period of silence, but instead of saying something meaningful, they keep it neutral. Maybe a casual comment on a post, a message about something practical, or a reaction to a shared interest. These interactions are their way of feeling close to you without exposing their emotions. Another subtle but telling sign is when they bring up inside jokes or shared memories. An avoidant may not say, "I miss you," but they might reference something that only the two of you would understand. For example, they might text you out of nowhere saying, Remember that time we got lost on our road trip? Or I just saw someone wearing those ridiculous shoes you used to love. These moments are not random. They are calculated ways to test the waters and remind you of the bond you shared. In some cases, an avoidant will reappear in your orbit through coincidental encounters. Maybe you start running into them at places you used to visit together, or they suddenly become active in social circles that overlap with yours. These encounters might seem accidental, but often they are intentional. An avoidant who misses you might not have the courage to reach out directly, so they create opportunities to cross paths in a way that feels organic. Another major sign is emotional fluctuations in their behavior toward you. If you do communicate with them, you might notice that their energy shifts unpredictably. One moment they seem engaged, even warm, and the next they pull away again. This is the classic push-pull dynamic of an avoidant. They miss you, so they reach out, but the moment they feel emotionally vulnerable, they retreat. If you see this pattern, it's a clear indication that they are struggling with their feelings for you. Some avoidants show they miss you through nostalgic behaviors. Maybe they keep things that remind them of you, photos, gifts, or even something as small as a song you introduced them to. You might hear from mutual friends that they still mention you in conversations, or that they haven't moved on as much as they appear to. Avoidants are good at pretending they are fine, but their attachment often lingers beneath the surface. Another surprising sign is indirect jealousy. If they see you moving on or spending time with someone new, they might not express it directly, but their behavior will shift. They may become distant, passive-aggressive, or suddenly try to assert themselves in your life again. They might even downplay your new relationship by making casual but dismissive comments like, "Oh, so you're into that type now?" Or, "I see you've been busy." These remarks may seem lighthearted, but they are actually signs of suppressed emotions. For some avoidants, missing you manifests through self-improvement efforts. They might start working on themselves in ways that align with past conversations you had together. Maybe they finally take up that hobby you always encouraged, start dressing differently, or work on habits they know were an issue in the relationship. This is not always an intentional attempt to win you back, but it does indicate that you left an impact on them. One of the more confusing signs is acting indifferent or cold when they see you. If you unexpectedly run into an avoidant, their initial reaction might be to act like they don't care. They might be distant, uninterested, or even act as if your presence doesn't affect them at all. This can be incredibly misleading because, in reality, this is often their defense mechanism kicking in. The stronger the feelings they have, the more they try to suppress them by creating emotional distance. Some avoidants express their longing through small but meaningful interactions. If they offer to help you with something, check in on you through mutual friends, or suddenly remember details about your life that you never expected them to remember, these are all signs that they are still emotionally connected to you. Avoidants may not always verbalize their emotions, but they often reveal them through small gestures. It's also common for an avoidant who misses you to reconnect when you stop chasing. When they sense that you are truly moving on and no longer investing energy into them, it triggers a response. Avoidants are often most comfortable when they feel in control, and the moment they realize they might actually lose you, their suppressed emotions rise to the surface. This is why many avoidants reappear just as you begin to let go. Another overlooked sign is engaging in indirect communication. This could mean posting things on social media that seem aimed at you, listening to songs that hold meaning in your relationship, or even sharing quotes that reflect their emotional state. Avoidants rarely make their feelings obvious, but if you start noticing patterns in the things they share, it may be their way of expressing emotions they can't say outright. Even in no tangible situations, an avoidant who misses you will still leave behind clues. They may not chase or confess their feelings, but their actions, however small, reveal the truth. If you know what to look for, their subtle behaviors tell a much deeper story than their silence ever could. One of the most confusing aspects of dealing with an avoidant is their contradictory behavior, the push-pull dynamic. This is where they seem to both want and resist connection at the same time. When an avoidant misses you, they won't necessarily reach out in a direct way. Instead, their emotions play tug-of-war inside them. One moment they may want to be close to you, the next they feel overwhelmed by that very thought and withdraw again. This cycle is not just frustrating for you, it's a deeply ingrained pattern in how they handle relationships. To truly understand this, you have to recognize that avoidants associate closeness with potential loss of control. Deep down, they crave connection like anyone else, but they've also learned that attachment can be suffocating, painful, or even dangerous. As a result, they try to regulate their emotions by controlling proximity. This means they will pull you in when they feel safe, then push you away when emotions get too intense. One of the most common ways the push-pull dynamic plays out is through inconsistent communication. You may notice that an avoidant will text you out of nowhere, act warm and engaged for a brief period, and then suddenly disappear. This is not because they stopped missing you. It's because their emotional alarm bells went off. As soon as they start feeling too vulnerable, their defense mechanism kicks in, telling them to retreat. Another way the push-pull pattern reveals itself is through mixed signals. They might send a casual message that seems like a simple check-in, but if you respond with emotional depth, they suddenly go cold. They might show up unexpectedly in places where they know you'll be, only to act indifferent when you interact. They may bring up old memories, but if you reciprocate with warmth, they brush it off as if it meant nothing. They brush it off as if it meant nothing. This is not a sign that they don't care. It's a sign that they are battling their own inner resistance to attachment. The push-pull cycle can also manifest in indirect ways. An avoidant may start reaching out, but instead of discussing emotions, they find an excuse to engage with you in a way that feels neutral. Maybe they ask for a favor, return something they borrowed, or send a message about a completely unrelated topic. These moments are not random. They are calculated ways to reestablish connection without fully stepping into vulnerability. One of the most telling aspects of the push-pull dynamic is an avoidance reaction to your behavior. If they feel like you are emotionally available and seeking connection, they instinctively withdraw. But the moment they sense that you are detaching, their longing starts to surface. This is why many avoidants reappear when they feel you slipping away. If you've ever noticed that they suddenly check in just as you begin to move on, this is not a coincidence. It's because your emotional distance creates space for them to process their feelings without feeling overwhelmed. Another key pattern to look for is how they handle time apart. Unlike someone with an anxious attachment who feels immediate distress when separated from a loved one, an avoidant often seems perfectly fine at first, but this is an illusion. Avoidants have a delayed emotional processing system. When a breakup or separation happens, they don't necessarily feel the full impact right away. They convince themselves that being alone is better, that they are fine without the relationship, and that they don't need to address their emotions. However, as time goes on, their defenses start to weaken. The distractions they use to suppress their feelings, work, hobbies, socializing, start to lose their effectiveness. They begin to feel a void, but because they are conditioned to avoid emotional discomfort, they don't immediately act on it. Instead, they wait, they observe, and they look for ways to reconnect without fully confronting their emotions. This delayed response is one of the biggest reasons why avoidants often reappear after long periods of no contact. When they do, it's rarely a grand confession. Instead, it's something small, a casual text, a random interaction, a reaction to your social media. It's their way of testing whether the door is still open. But here's where the cycle gets tricky. If they sense that you are still emotionally available, they may start to feel the familiar fear of intimacy creeping back in. They might engage for a little while, but as soon as the emotional stakes feel too high, they retreat again. This can be exhausting if you're on the receiving end of it, because it makes it feel like they are playing games. But in reality, this is not about manipulation. It's about their deep-seated fear of closeness and loss of autonomy. For an avoidant, the push-pull cycle is their way of maintaining control over their emotions. They believe that by keeping distance, they can avoid the pain of rejection or engulfment. But what they fail to realize is that this very pattern keeps them trapped in a cycle of longing and avoidance. They miss you when they are far away, but the moment they get too close, they fear losing themselves. This is why some avoidants will even self-sabotage when things start to feel too intimate. They may pick fights, create unnecessary distance, or convince themselves that the relationship isn't right, just to regain a sense of emotional safety. This doesn't mean they don't care. It means their attachment system is wired to prioritize self-protection over connection. Another revealing sign in the push-pull dynamic is how they respond when you finally let go. If an avoidant realizes that you are no longer engaging in their cycle, it can trigger an unexpected reaction. At first, they may seem unaffected, but as time passes and they see that you are genuinely moving on, the reality of losing you starts to sink in. This is often when they make a sudden reappearance, either directly or indirectly. Avoidants rarely chase in a traditional way. Instead, they might engage in passive re-engagement, posting things on social media that they know will catch your attention, asking mutual friends about you, or creating coincidental encounters. These moments are their way of staying connected without putting themselves in a position of emotional vulnerability. For some avoidants, missing you doesn't mean reaching out, it means retreating even further. This is because missing someone makes them feel powerless, and the only way they know how to regain control is by doubling down on their emotional walls. They may avoid places they associate with you, cut off communication even more, or immerse themselves in distractions. But make no mistake, this extreme form of avoidance often signals deep emotional conflict. The more they push down their emotions, the more they build up over time. The push-pull dynamic is exhausting for both the avoidant and the person on the receiving end. It creates confusion, frustration, and emotional exhaustion. But if you understand it, you stop taking their actions personally. You begin to see that their distance is not about you, it's about their own battle with intimacy. Recognizing the signs of this cycle allows you to step back and observe without getting caught in the emotional whirlwind. It helps you understand that when an avoidant pushes you away, it's not because they don't care, it's because caring feels risky to them. They miss you, but that longing is constantly fighting against their deep-rooted need to protect themselves. When an avoidant misses you, they won't show it the way you might expect. They won't come knocking on your door with flowers, pouring out their emotions, or sending you a long, heartfelt text about how much they regret losing you. In fact, they may not even reach out at all. But does that mean they don't miss you? Absolutely not. The truth is, avoidants suppress their emotions so deeply that even when they feel a strong longing for you, their default response is to push those feelings down rather than express them. To understand why an avoidant won't admit they miss you, you need to look at the core of their attachment style. Avoidants grow up learning that emotions, especially those involving attachment and dependency, are unsafe. They might have had caregivers who were emotionally unavailable, dismissive, or even overwhelming, leading them to associate closeness with discomfort or loss of control. Because of this, they develop a coping mechanism, emotional suppression. They convince themselves that they don't need others, that they are better off alone, and that vulnerability is a weakness. But here's the thing. This suppression doesn't eliminate their emotions. It just buries them. One of the clearest signs of an avoidant missing you is their obsessive need to stay in control of their emotions. Unlike someone with an anxious attachment style who openly expresses their longing and seeks reassurance, an avoidant does the opposite. They will go out of their way to distract themselves, throwing themselves into work, hobbies, or social activities. They might act indifferent, as if nothing has changed, but beneath the surface, their mind is still processing the loss. The more they suppress their emotions, the stronger they actually are. You might notice that after a breakup or a period of distance, an avoidant seems completely unaffected. They don't text, they don't call, and they might even appear happy on social media. This is their protective mechanism at work. But what's happening behind the scenes is that they are avoiding any triggers that might force them to confront their feelings. They won't listen to the songs that remind them of you. They won't go to places you used to visit together. They won't let themselves dwell on the past, because doing so would mean acknowledging how much they truly miss you. But here's where it gets interesting. Emotional suppression doesn't mean emotional absence. It just means their feelings take longer to surface. Unlike someone who immediately feels the weight of separation, an avoidant often experiences delayed emotional processing. At first, they might feel relieved, as if a weight has been lifted. They might tell themselves that being alone is better, that relationships are too complicated, or that they are perfectly fine. But as time goes on, something shifts. The distractions stop working as well. The busyness isn't as fulfilling. The emotional numbness begins to wear off. And the feelings they suppressed start creeping back in. This is why many avoidants reappear after long periods of no contact. It's not that they didn't miss you all along. It's that they were working overtime to suppress those feelings. When they can no longer hold them down, they start looking for indirect ways to reestablish a connection. But instead of outright saying, "I miss you," they will find subtler ways to engage. Maybe they watch your Instagram stories like an old post, or send a random message that seems completely unrelated to your relationship. These actions might seem insignificant, but for an avoidant, they are actually major indicators that they are struggling with their emotions. Another reason an avoidant won't admit they miss you is because acknowledging their emotions feels like giving up control. Admitting they miss you means admitting they care, and caring means opening themselves up to potential rejection or emotional pain. For an avoidant, emotions can feel overwhelming, almost like a loss of autonomy. They've spent years convincing themselves that they don't need anyone, so to suddenly realize that they do, that they miss you, that they still think about you, that their feelings never actually went away, is incredibly unsettling. Instead of leaning into these emotions, they double down on their independence. Some avoidants will go as far as convincing themselves they don't miss you, even when their actions say otherwise. This is a self-preservation strategy. They will find ways to rationalize the separation, telling themselves things like, "It wasn't meant to be, I'm better off alone," or "They probably don't miss me anyway." These self-imposed narratives help them justify their emotional suppression. But even if they aren't consciously admitting it, their behavior reveals the truth. For example, an avoidant who doesn't miss you wouldn't keep checking in on your life. They wouldn't bring you up in conversations with mutual friends. They wouldn't randomly resurface after months of silence. They wouldn't suddenly post things on social media that seem tailor-made to catch your attention. These small actions might not seem like much, but for an avoidant, they are signs of internal conflict, the battle between missing you and refusing to admit it. One of the most telling signs that an avoidant is suppressing their feelings is their reaction when they see you moving on. While they may act indifferent on the surface, deep down, an avoidant who truly misses you will feel unsettled when they realize they no longer have a place in your life. They might not beg you to stay, but you'll notice shifts in their behavior. Maybe they start reaching out more. Maybe they start acting jealous in subtle ways, making sarcastic comments about your new relationship. downplaying your happiness, or suddenly finding reasons to be in your orbit again. They might not say the words, "I miss you," but their actions will scream it. For some avoidants, missing you manifests as avoiding you completely. They might ghost you, block you, or disappear entirely. This isn't because they don't care. It's because they care so much that facing you would force them to confront emotions they don't know how to handle. Avoidants believe that by cutting ties, they can regain control over their feelings. But what they don't realize is that avoidance only prolongs the inevitable. Even when they are in deep denial, an avoidance longing eventually catches up with them. And when it does, they are left with two choices: continue suppressing their emotions and risk losing a meaningful connection, or face their fears and allow themselves to be vulnerable. Unfortunately, many avoidants choose the former, not because they don't care, but because they've spent their entire lives believing that emotional independence is the only way to stay safe. But suppression is not the same as absence. The fact that they won't admit they miss you doesn't mean they don't. It just means they are still fighting a battle between their heart and their fears. When an avoidant misses you, they will not reach out in a way that feels obvious or direct. They won't send a long message confessing their feelings. They won't show up at your door asking for a second chance. Instead, they will find subtle, indirect ways to re-enter your life. These actions are their way of reconnecting without making themselves emotionally vulnerable. Because avoidants fear intimacy and the emotional risks that come with it, they will test the waters before making any real move. One of the most common ways an avoidant attempts to reconnect is through social media engagement. They may not send you a message, but suddenly they start watching your stories. They might like an old post from months ago, something so subtle that it almost feels accidental, but it's not. It's a quiet signal. They are checking in on you without actually having to reach out. This is their way of maintaining a sense of connection without stepping into a conversation that might make them feel exposed. Sometimes an avoidant will go even further. They may post something that seems specifically designed to catch your attention. Maybe they post a song that has meaning between you two. Maybe they upload a photo from a place you used to visit together. Maybe they share a vague quote about missing someone but never directly say it's about you. These are all calculated moves, ways for them to express their emotions without actually admitting them. Another key sign of an avoidant trying to reconnect is random, out-of-the-blue contact. But instead of saying, "Hey, I miss you," they will find an excuse to reach out. They might text you about something completely unrelated to emotions, maybe asking a question about a TV show you both liked, or saying they accidentally found something of yours. They will act like it's casual, but the reality is they have been thinking about you. They don't know how to break the silence in a way that feels safe, so they use a neutral reason to initiate contact. Sometimes an avoidant will reconnect through mutual friends. They might casually ask people in your circle how you're doing, or they may suddenly start showing up in places where they know you'll be. They won't say it's because they miss you, but the timing is too coincidental to ignore. Maybe they start frequenting your favorite coffee shop. Maybe they join a group hangout they normally wouldn't have attended. These are subtle ways they create opportunities to see you without taking the emotional risk of reaching out directly. Another telltale sign is their reaction to seeing you move on. If an avoidant notices that you are happy without them, they may suddenly start finding ways to insert themselves back into your life. They might not outright say they want you back, but they will start showing more interest. Maybe they start replying to your stories when they used to ignore them. Maybe they engage in playful banter, trying to reignite the connection. Maybe they even bring up inside jokes or old memories to subtly remind you of what you shared. This isn't just nostalgia. It's a sign that they are struggling with the idea of losing you completely. In some cases, an avoidant will try to reconnect by acting as if nothing ever happened. This is their way of bypassing difficult emotions. They might reach out with a friendly message, pretending like the breakup or distance never occurred. They don't want to have a deep emotional conversation, so instead, they act like everything is normal. They may even invite you to hang out in a low-pressure setting, something casual that doesn't force them to confront their deeper feelings. For some avoidants, jealousy is a trigger. If they see you with someone new, they may react in unexpected ways. Maybe they suddenly start talking to you again, acting as if they're just being friendly, but the timing is suspicious. Maybe they make passive-aggressive comments or try to downplay your new connection. Maybe they even start dating someone themselves. Not necessarily because they've moved on, but because they need a distraction from the feelings they refuse to admit. Another common behavior is indirect communication, relying on signs rather than words. An avoidant may not tell you they miss you, but they will show it in nonverbal ways. If you run into them in person, their body language might give them away. They might hold eye contact longer than usual. Their tone might soften, or they might mirror your gestures without realizing it. These small, unconscious actions reveal their internal conflict. They miss you, but they are still trying to protect themselves from emotional vulnerability. In some cases, an avoidant will try to reconnect by being more present but still distant. They might start engaging with you more frequently, but only to a certain extent. Maybe they initiate a conversation but disappear when it starts getting too deep. Maybe they show interest in your life but avoid personal topics. This is their way of keeping you close without stepping outside their comfort zone. A key thing to understand about avoidance is that their way of missing you does not look like what you expect. They won't chase in the traditional sense. They won't beg for a second chance. Instead, they will test your availability through subtle, indirect actions. They need to feel safe before they fully re-engage, which is why their approach is often inconsistent. Another fascinating sign of an avoidant missing you is their sudden interest in self-improvement. They may start going to therapy, working out more, or focusing on personal growth. While this could be for themselves, it's often triggered by the realization that losing you has had an impact on them. They may not admit it, but deep down, they know they need to address their emotional barriers if they ever want to have a deeper connection. Some avoidants try to reconnect through humor or lighthearted teasing. Instead of admitting their feelings, they might joke around with you, trying to recreate the playful dynamic you once had. This is their way of lowering their defenses. By keeping things light, they avoid vulnerability while still maintaining a connection. Avoidants also have a tendency to linger in the background of your life. Even if they aren't reaching out directly, they will find ways to stay connected. They may not message you, but they check your online status. They may not ask how you're doing, but they make sure to stay in your orbit. They don't want to fully let go, but they also don't know how to fully re-engage. For some, missing you manifests as extreme avoidance. Instead of trying to reconnect, they disappear completely. They may delete you from social media, cut off contact, or go silent for long periods. This is because the emotions they are suppressing feel too overwhelming, and rather than risk feeling exposed, they retreat entirely. But just because they are avoiding you doesn't mean they don't care. It means they care so much that they don't know how to process it. Understanding an avoidant's indirect attempts to reconnect requires you to look beyond words. Their actions, no matter how subtle, often reveal the emotions they are trying to hide.